Hello and welcome to a Conquest, the last argument of King's battle report. In this game we're playing an experimental 100 Kingdoms list versus Dweghom, and the scenario is melee. Fair note, I will be proxying heavily during this game using my old Dominion. I don't actually own 100 Kingdoms. Those models on the screen at the moment are courtesy of Goonhammer author Thankful, and you can find his work literally if you just Google Goonhammer Conquest. Let's look at the lists. So this is the 100 Kingdoms list that I'm playing for this game, and I've wanted to try something like this out for some time. This is an experiment in an activation advantage MSU style list in Conquest. Now, if you've watched Song of Ice and Fire battle reports or have played Song of Ice and Fire, you'll be aware of the fact that in Song, activation advantage is a really major part of the game, and there are a number of factors in Song that let players take advantage of activation counts to have, for example, an advantage over their opponent if they have 8 or 9 activations to their opponent's 6 or 7. Now, many of the things that allow you to do that in Song don't exist in Conquest, but I've wanted to basically experiment for a while now and see, was there any advantage to be gained in significant activation counts in Conquest, and what effect did it have on the game? And as a result, this is the highest practical activation count that I think I can do in Conquest. You can probably force a higher activation count than this, but the returns will be rapidly diminishing. And given that the average activation count for Conquest armies is somewhere between 10 and 12, going all the way up to 15 like this list does feels like it's sufficient. That gives me 3 to 5 activations at the end of a round over my opponent that I can use, if indeed that's something that is useful in Conquest. So the list has 2 identical Imperial officer warbands. There is no special equipment on like any unit in this entire character in this entire army. So it's 4 units of Mercenary Crossbowmen, 4 units of Steel Legion. These Steel Legion are veterans, so they have their Drillmasters and Standard Bearers, which means they'll be having 6 attacks at Clash 4 per stand. Then we have a Mounted Noble Lord with a pleb unit of Militia Bowmen and a militia unit with a neophyte in it. One of the things I always try and do in lists, if I can, is find just like a source of interference, particularly for matchups against things like Old Dominion or Dweghom. So the militia with Neophyte are in there for that. Then we have 2 units of Household Knights. Now these aren't particularly special Household Knights, they just have their Standard Bearers, they aren't veteran. They do have Speed of Horse from the Mounted Noble Lord. I've seen some people say that in this kind of list you don't want to take 2 warlords, and in fact 100 Kingdoms generally doesn't want to take 2 warlords despite it being their special rule, because the 2 points that you give up in many scenarios isn't worthwhile. I think that's very dumb, in point of fact. I have never seen a game decided by 2 points. I'm sure it does happen and can happen, but I'm not going to give up some advantage that might win me the game on the off chance that losing that character gives up 2 points and loses it. I think the balance there is good, even for a Warlord bonus as kind of anemic as the Mounted Noble's Lords is in a list like this. You can make the Mounted Noble Lord Speed of Horse do a lot. It isn't trying to do a lot in this list. In this list, the Household Knights really are just filling the role of fast, chonky dudes. They can do some damage, they have okay impact attacks, they can fight fine, but really for 140 points, what you basically get for Household Knights is a pretty damn good unit of medium infantry that randomly happens to be speed 4. You look at their stats, they're effectively defense 4, resolve 3, 5 attacks each, like that's totally okay. That's competitive with basically anything for 140 points. Now, they are restricted rather than being mainstay. You'd find a unit like this would be a mainstay unit in something like Dweghom, for example. They are restricted, but I'm hoping that they will be doing something useful. Overall, what the list is trying to do is take advantage of its activations to deliver some kind of a decisive blow or get an early scenario lead and maneuver those like very, very fast Steel Legion. Those Steel Legion units they can absolutely motor. Nothing in Conquest is truly nimble without fluid formation, but those Steel Legion will move 16 inches the turn they arrive and 16 inches the turns after that if they want to, thanks to double time, which should hypothetically let me get some kind of maneuver advantage. Otherwise, the list is very good at scoring early. Those Imperial officers are medium, they will be going into those mercenary crossbows, and they will be giving them both fire and advance and aim for the head, and then the Mounted Noble Lord just has cleave 1. So this is a lot of things, although it isn't a resilient list. The Steel Legion are like kind of tough, but they're still just 4 wound troopers. Nothing in this list has more than 4 wounds a stand. The best defense is defense 3 with a shield on the knights, otherwise it's 3 or 2 or 1. The list isn't durable, and it's hoping to try and make some use of activation advantage. It's going to be playing into Dweghom using this list. So this is the list that my opponent Tom will be playing, and to be perfectly honest, it's kind of nightmarish for what I'm trying to accomplish, and just generally. This is a list that Tom has been iterating on over many games, actually, as he gets his army painted up and built, and to be perfectly blunt, it's very, very good. There are things that you can do to change, like different parts of how this list work, but if you wanted just a template list for Dweghom, you could do much worse than this list here. It's outstanding. So what we have is we have a Tempered Sorcerer that is juiced nearly all the way up. It's kitted out for maximum offensive spellcasting, except it doesn't have Chthonic Flame, or the artifact that gives you +1 in exchange for taking wounds from resolve checks. So he's going to be rolling 7 dice with 1 auto success and 2 rerolls with all of the Tempered Fire Sorcerer spells. He's going in a unit of Fireforge with the banner. Then there's just a unit of generic Hold Warriors. They're a medium unit that will try and score. Totally serviceable for 130 points. And then 2 units of Inferno Automata. These are going to cause me tremendous problems because they're very, very good, and in particular, they are just hands down incredible predators of units like those crossbows that I have. Those crossbows want to just get up the field early and kind of just like peck away at things and then pull back if they get into trouble and not really be involved in the main fight, but Inferno Automata are the best unit in the game for bringing the main fight to your opponent. There are light units that are faster than the Automata, but they are not more mobile than the Automata thanks to fluid formation. So Inferno Automata just very, very fast, very, very dangerous, and in particular, they're difficult to respond to. If I was playing into something like Strix in the Spires, which are a very dangerous because of their speed and caustic demise unit running to engage crossbows, I could manage that because Strix can't really once they're set on a path, yeah, they can wheel, but they don't really turn on a dime. Whereas Inferno Automata can move into sort of the middle of the table and then project threat in 360 degrees, which means that if you position a unit to respond to them, like say my Household Knights, they'll just go somewhere else. So very, very scary, excellent unit. It have ruined me in many games, and I wish Tom didn't own 2 units, but they are wonderfully painted, so fair enough. Otherwise, we have a Tempered Steel Shaper with Retinue 1 in a unit of Hold Ballistae. This is a scoring unit because he is a medium, just very high utility, and a unit of Steel Forged. Steel Forged are probably the best medium unit in the game at the moment. And honestly, by a pretty comfortable margin, they are just a huge pile of stats. They are very, very tough, very, very durable, but in this game at least, I will have pretty much as much cleave to as it's possible to fit in a 100 Kingdoms list, so I think I can deal with them. Otherwise, the heavies in my opponent's list will probably be the most challenging thing, apart from everything in the Tempered Sorcerer warband. We have a Hold Reg, and all he has is Tactical Retinue 1 for Indomitable, but he has a big unit of Hold Thanes with a Standard Bearer and a Herald of Fire, which makes that regiment attack 5 and attack 7 on the command stand, and then Dragon Slayers with a Mimnancer Apprentice, which means that they get a free dual action, and if you refuse, the regiment actually breaks. So they're very scary Dragon Slayers who will easily kill any of my characters. So overall, this is an outstanding, just generally outstanding Dweghom list. It's got great heavies, it's got great lights, it's got great mediums, it's got huge offensive potential, and the scenario that we're playing, Melee, is also really an acid test for this kind of list that I'm trying out. But to talk about that, let's jump to the table. So here we are set up pre-game for the scenario Melee. In terms of terrain, what we have are what we're calling dense forests. Dense forests are hindering and obstructing. We have 2 of those. One is quite large, one is relatively small. By relatively small, I mean Conquest terrain standard. Conquest terrain rules, you've heard me say before, tend to guide players towards very small terrain. This is technically very illegal, but I like it. We then have a loose forest over here, which is just obscuring. We have a water feature over here, and we have 2 obstructing impassable terrain pieces here and here, these sort of mausoleums. Now, The forests will definitely matter this game. I've got units that want to make impact attacks, so does Tom. The obscuring really won't. The obstructing is just enough to be kind of annoying. I quite like these small obstructing terrain features I prefer for Conquest. Really big ones can be cool too, but be aware that you will warp the game around them, which is okay some of the time. Now, melee. Why is melee a challenging scenario for this list that I've written? Why is it kind of a worst case scenario? Melee is challenging for this list because it's one of the scenarios, not every Conquest scenario has this, but it's a Conquest scenario where you score 2 points for killing a unit, 2 points for killing a character, and an extra 2 points for killing a Warlord. This is not hugely common, not the majority of Conquest scenarios don't have them, but plenty of them do. And if you're running a spammy list, particularly a very spammy list that expects to lose units, you are going to give up quite a lot of VPs. Now, the silver lining here is that I've got plenty of relatively fast units that could potentially score early, and scenario scoring is also very live. Melee is a very, very high score scenario. I am not going to write down what the score is for this game. But in terms of scenario scoring, not for kill points, we have two 12-inch zones and two 6-inch zones. You score 3 points for dominating, by which I mean having more scoring stands, etc. A large zone, 2 points for a small zone, and 2 points for scoring 2 or more zones. That's how we played it. That was the card that we drew out of the pack, etc. Which does mean that if you can score quite a lot of zones early, and particularly if you can score 3 zones and limit your opponent to scoring 1, that will mean that you score potentially 10 points while they score 2, which is a pretty big advantage to rack up. But remember, Conquest is a 10-turn game. Getting a scoring advantage in turn 2 or turn 3 or turn 4 alone really represents only a third of the potential scoring time in the game. And that is very, very relevant and is going to be relevant in this game. Now, from here, I'm going to try and move through relatively quickly and just explain the tactical schools of thought and high points, moments of drama in each turn. Let's move on to turn 1. So on turn 1, quite a lot has happened in terms of posturing. Many things have arrived on the board. All of Tom's light regiments arrived, so we have his Inferno Automata here and here, wonderfully painted. We have his Ballistae with Steel Shaper here, and then I've just brought on 4 units of Mercenary Crossbowmen and 1 unit of Bowmen, Militia Bowmen. Now this is where the proxies are going to get a little bit weird, but I assure you that these are crossbowmen here, and then the bowmen are hanging out there. The militia spearmen are not going to turn up yet, and in fact they won't turn up until turn 3, but I'm totally fine with that because what I want to do is wait to bring them on until I can see where the Fireforged Sorcerer is, because they are there to provide a bubble to vaguely defend against his attacks. Now, we're just posturing here, but I have made what might actually be a mistake in this circumstance, which is I have done what people tend to do and what I find myself doing in this kind of a situation, which is I've spread out along a very long line. Now, there's a little bit of bowing in the line here and here, with the idea being that these units can mutually support one another and maybe fire into melee when the automata come in. But Tom, by comparison, is layering his troops. They are able to leapfrog one another. I'm not set up to do that. And I think there's a pretty solid argument that potentially I should have been. If you think about, for example, maybe if I had a unit of crossbows here behind this unit, what am I going to be firing against? I'm going to be shooting into size 2 units, into brutes, because it's the Inferno Automata that are the huge threat right now. So hanging out in line like this is probably a mistake. I can afford to, and indeed I should probably be concentrating force much, much more than I am. So that's an immediate thing that I've fallen into kind of like a basic habit and formed up in line in the way that you do you kind of have to with melee regiments, but which you don't have to with ranged regiments. So early in the game, how are things looking? Well, you can see that Tom is in a relatively tight, mutually supporting formation. His flank is protected by this. He is exposed to some range fire, but the thing about these Inferno Automata is that they can threaten in all directions. They can go anywhere into really about this space here, which is part of why they're so very good. And I have formed up to try and have some mutually supporting bow fire against them, but really it's not a tight enough formation. And they're going to be on me before I can necessarily respond with melee elements. So jumping to turn 2. So this is the end of turn 2, and we can see that, yep, the Inferno Automata have at least partly gotten into melee. Now this is definitely an it could be worse situation. These automata have decided that basically moving long distance over here is not something they want to do yet. They've stayed in range of the Steel Shapers bubble, and they've just moved to posture and threaten against my range units here. I think I fired a couple of shots into them from each of these units, and I did a little bit of damage. Like, I think I've done maybe 3 wounds to this regiment, just sort of setting it up. But they are really poised to hammer into one of these two. We've got Mercenary Crossbows here and Bowmen here. On this flank, the Imperial Officers unit has run all the way up into this 12-inch zone. On this flank, we've got horses that have moved up 15 inches. 15 inches is exactly enough to get inside this bubble, so I'm scoring 2 zones here. And then over here, the Inferno Automata on this flank have charged in. They've had to go through this forest, so they haven't done as much damage as they might otherwise have done, I think is what's happened here. And I've basically been kind of lucky with defense dice and resolve checks. I have suffered only 5 wounds to this regiment after Aura of Death. And that, all things considered, I'll take that, because it's very possible to lose an entire regiment very quickly to these. Knowing that I'm going to have to kill this regiment, I've set up to respond. We've got the Noble Lord in his unit of Household Knights here, and then this crossbow unit is firing into the flank after a reform. And it's this firing and then an inspired clash from these guys that has done so far, I think, 7 wounds to these Inferno Automata, which is getting there, basically. I am hoping to be able to put enough force into this, and in particular, I'm hoping that this regiment doesn't completely die, because they're worth 4 points. In terms of my Warlords, it's this one over here, and then this 2. These are my 2 Warlords, and of course Tom's hasn't arrived on the battlefield yet. Otherwise, Steelforge have turned up here, and then the Steel Shaper is just continuing to cast spells. End of turn 3 now, and further action is beginning to take place, and we've had one interesting thing. I'll talk about what's happened on this lower flank here first. Now, I've gotten basically pretty lucky, and I have taken out these Inferno Automata without taking basically a full casualty to this stand here. So the Crossbowmen and Imperial Officer on my left flank are alive, which is excellent. We've actually been able to do that without the Knights have not had to charge into melee, so we've taken them out, and the Knights have actually been able to cleanly move past, thanks to supporting fire from these crossbows. So the overlapping support on this flank, mostly off the grounds of good defense dice, if I'm being honest, has held out here. We've dealt with 1 unit of Inferno Automata. These Hold Warriors are posturing to move up to this zone, but for now, I'm scoring on this zone here. In the center, we've had a cheeky march and charge, and there was just space, basically. This Knight regiment that was in this position here moved 7 inches forward, and then we had a 5+ rerollable charge here, and I rolled a 6, and that was enough for them to wheel around, move without touching the Steelforge in a straight line, contact, and then I didn't do any impact attacks, but I've engaged the Hold Ballista regiment, and I'm in a pretty good, this fight, what is absolutely going to happen is that reinforcements in some capacity will arrive, even if it's just the Steelforged reforming and charging. But if they do that, they're moving through the forest. So I have basically a turn or 2 for these Knights to fight and maybe kill this Steel Shapers regiment. Over here, the Inferno Automata have crashed into a unit of Hold Ballistae and have annihilated it on the charge. Remember that this forest here is a loose forest and therefore is not hindering, so just completely annihilated those crossbows. And they've actually been countercharged by the Peasant Bowmen, who did a little bit of damage actually and took out 1 stand, and that is specifically to hold them in place, because I finally had my Peasant Militia show up, and they've showed up in position to countercharge. Now, they're here because the Fireforged with Sorcerer have turned up here. I really don't want to expose these to too much danger, but I have to do something to them, basically. Something to deal with these Inferno Automata, basically. Now, it's on this flank here that we are starting to see a little bit of some of how you can make activation advantage a thing, but not really. What I've done here on this flank is that I've had my crossbowmen kind of woven throughout my deck, just sort of spread relatively evenly throughout the deck, so that on any given activation, I've got a decent chance of it being a crossbow unit that's up next. And how that I did that just kind of out of a little bit of habit, because I wasn't sure how the turn would play out. But what it's enabled me to do is that when the Sorcerer turned up here with his crossbows, with his Fireforged rather, I was fortunate enough that my very next thing to draw was a unit of crossbows, and this unit had not activated yet. And that let them basically bug all the way back out and get out of range of the Sorcerer's spells, which meant that this unit is alive rather than dead, because there's a very good chance that if the Sorcerer was able to load up on this unit, they would be dead. And that basically this is frankly going to be just about the high point for this game. We've had one unit. We've had Steel Legion turn up here and Steel Legion turn up here. Now, obviously, we're very far away up the board because we have the Vanguard move from the Imperial Officer, and this is a very good turn because this turn I have scored literally every zone. We've scored here, or we've equalized the score here rather. So Tom doesn't score this zone. I've scored 3, this zone and this zone, which means that this turn I'm actually going to score 10 points to Tom's 0. But we are losing units, and remember, Conquest at the moment is a 10-turn game. You need to maintain this kind of advantage for a long time, and that's going to be difficult. What my plan is to try and establish basically like a dominant advantage somewhere. And specifically what I'm hoping to do is really just not have to fight Thanes and Dragon Slayers. Ideally, I want to draw Tom into a situation where he commits the Thanes and the Dragon Slayer somewhere, and I just leave them on objectives, ideally. I don't want to pursue them. I don't want to fight them. I can't really beat both of those units. They're just too juicy. Like they're tough. They're heavy. They're juiced up. So they're too juicy. Excellent. What I'm hoping to do is to pull them onto scenario zones and just cede that ground and win decisively elsewhere, so that the status quo carries me through to endgame. But to do that, we are going to have to deal with this unit here, which of course is the Fireforge with the Tempered Sorcerer. But we have a plan. So, jumping forward to end of turn 4, and how are things going? Well, what have we done? Over here, we'll deal with fight by fight and talk about some of the high points. In this sort of like little center pocket here, the Inferno Automata has dealt with the unit of Peasant Bowmen, and unfortunately the Fireforged have moved far enough forward that the Sorcerer has been able to get range into the flank of the Peasant Militia and blown them up, which means that my source of interference is gone. We've moved a unit of Steel Legion to respawn so that they can hopefully kill these Inferno Automata and score me 2 points, so I really can't have this thing running around in my backfield. In the center, we've actually been able to get the jump on a unit of Steel Forged, and if nothing else, charging Steel Legion will absolutely monster Steel Forged. Steel Forged are a huge, like, prodigious bucket of stats, but the sheer offensive output of a 19 attack Clash 4 Cleave 2 unit is going to do the trick. Now, I will take some casualties over here, that is a thing that will happen, but basically we are going to get through this unit before anything else happens. The Knights are fighting against these Hold Warriors handily. The Hold Warriors, I think, actually march charge just to get in, but we're still securing this zone. The Knights will kill this regiment, but the Thanes have arrived here, and so, okay. There is really nothing that I have in this pocket that can deal with these Thanes. They're too tough, they're too dangerous. Cleave 1, AP 1 does nothing to Thanes. I would like to cede this territory, but I don't think I'm going to be able to. I'm probably not going to be able to get out in time, and so what I'm really just hoping to do is that this is a fighting retreat that does some damage to Tom's forces and just leaves the Thanes here. It isn't going to work out that way, but that's what I'm hoping for. Over here, the Knights have done a reasonable job fighting the Ballistae. They're working through them slowly. One of the useful things about having all of the little bits of pressure is that I am really heavily pressuring Tom's elemental pool. At the end of this turn, he has basically nothing in his elemental pool that can do anything. He's completely out of tokens, and Dweghom generate fewer tokens these days anyway, so that means that setting up for next turn is going to be some pretty high, solid, significant, I've got real offensive potential. And then Dragon Slayers are turned up over here, and this is the yep, this was going to happen eventually. These Knights are not ever in a million years going to be able to fight these Dragon Slayers. In fact, these Dragon Slayers probably comfortably one-shot the Knights if they can get even 2 stands in contact. All I'm really hoping for at this stage is that before they go, the Knights can take out these Ballistae. The big fulcrum of action is over here, and I have dedicated 2 full units of Steel Legion and the unit of Crossbowmen and the Imperial Officer to dealing with 1 unit of Fireforged with the Sorcerer. The plan, basically, what we have happening here is my plan for winning this flank. So we've got 2 units of very dangerous Steel Forged. Chip damage from these crossbows has meant that there are about 3 wounds sort of already on this unit of Fireforged, which means it has about 12 wounds remaining before the Sorcerer. I have 2 units of Steel Legion here. This one is an auto charge, this one is a 2+ rerollable charge. Both have line of sight to make that charge, and the plan is, at the beginning of next turn, regardless of whether or not I win or lose priority, Tom can't kill both of these units of Steel Legion, which means one of them is going to get into the Fireforged. And one healthy unit of Steel Legion, on average, wipes this unit of Fireforged out like pretty comfortably, and if it doesn't, I still have 2 crossbow stands here to finish them off. So this is a lot of force, like a lot of force for dealing with, frankly, not that much in terms of Tom's entire army in total, but it's necessary. Unfortunately, it's also where everything is going to come crashing down. So here we have what I think is the end of turn. I think we're up to turn 5 at this stage, end of turn 5. So about halfway through the game, and you will note great sadness up here. This appears to be a fully intact unit of Fireforged, not in melee with anything. So what has happened? What has happened is that I actually won priority, and I made the charge with the Imperial Officer Regiment. They went in, so that was 19 attacks, Clash 4, Inspired, Cleave 2, plus 4 attacks at Clash 3. They needed to deal 12 or 13 wounds to a Dweghom Defense 4, admittedly, unit with no elemental power tokens. And they rolled absolute garbage. Absolute garbage in this case still did, I think, 10 wounds to the regiment, but it wasn't, I needed to do 12 or 13, and I only did 10. And what that meant is that the Fireforged were fine, the Sorcerer activated and just exploded that unit, which among other things had my Warlord in it, so that's 6 points down the drain. He just, literally just went boom, and the unit disappeared. Now, that's not hugely surprising, I knew that was a risk. The damage that the Temperate Sorcerer can do is easily enough to wipe out regiments like Steel Legion, which are only defense 3. They have very good resolve, thanks to Oblivious, but that's what it is. And then this regiment over here, which previously had a 2+ charge, the distance had, the gap had been widened between them because of the casualties that had been taken. They also took casualties from a fireball, which meant that they failed what had become a 4+ rerollable charge. Which meant that they didn't get into melee, which means that this Fireforged and Sorcerer unit is 100% alive. Oh, I also didn't do enough damage with the follow-up shots from the crossbows. So, yeah, and by the time the Sorcerer had cast those spells, he had enough tokens to do a little bit against the crossbows. So this Fireforged unit is basically totally okay. Now, this is possibly, this 4+ rerollable charge, it's a 75% chance, but it may have been a mistake. And the reason why it may have been a mistake is that these units, because they have those Drillmasters, they have the double time, which means they can make 3 marches in a turn. One of the options I had, rather than charging, admittedly 75% chance, is I could have marched, and marched up and around like this and gotten comfortably into the flank of this regiment, which could have set me up to then, basically, I'm not in line of fire of the Sorcerer, I can charge the next turn. His counterpoint to that would be to activate the Fireforged, Reform, and Shoot, and they wouldn't have to have done that much damage to break this regiment because it's only 2 stands, but if they'd done that, then the Crossbowmen can shoot into the flank, and Crossbowmen shooting into the flank of a unit of Fireforged does actually threaten it. But ultimately, I went for the 75% chance to charge and just basically win the game, and I flubbed it. So that's a shame. And really, this is something that will happen with this kind of list, where these units are fragile, and because they are fragile, your plans are a little fragile. And because your plans are a little fragile, when you have this kind of bad luck materialize, it feels a lot more like it is catastrophic. And that's a thing. That's interesting. It is a particularly interesting finding. In terms of other stuff that's happened, this fight over here has resolved. So we've got dead Steelforged over here, unsurprising. We've got dead Cavalry and dead Hold Ballistae. What actually happened is that the Cavalry absolutely whiffed their roll into the Hold Ballistae. They got the Hold Ballistae down to 2 wounds. Then the Hold Ballistae activated and attempted to combat reform, in order to make more space for the Dragon Slayers. And the Dragon Slayers, then they failed their roll, took a wound, failed their 2 wounds, failed their resolve check, one of the 2 resolve checks, and died. So that was very, very funny. But it nevertheless accomplished the goal that it needed to, which was making space for the Dragon Slayers, who just absolutely annihilated the cavalry, which is what you would expect. You don't even, Fiend Slayer does not apply against cavalry, it only works against brutes and monsters, but Dragon Slayers are a Cleave 3 Clash 4, they just went straight through that unit like prunes through a grandmother. Otherwise, on this flank, the Imperial Officer has jumped around here, trying to start making his way through this unit in order to jump into this, basically to score this objective. I am still scoring this objective with these Steeled Legion, and then the Thanes have come in here, and they've just charged. But this is now officially a fight where I expect these knights to die next turn. If I could do something like maybe it would be worth, if I had priority and I could activate the knights early, I can just like reform and run the hell away. And to be honest, that might have been the play that I should have made had I had like less pressure on my activations. But obviously going into the next turn, what am I going to do? I'm going to try and put Steel Forged first, so Steel Legion first, so that I can charge into those Fireforged and win the game. But spoiler alert, that's not going to happen. So scoring is going to be equal this turn, where I score this zone and this zone, Tom scores this zone and this zone, and with the quality of Tom's heavy regiments, really at this juncture, if I can win here, I can still win the game. At the moment, like right now, I am, even with the points from losing units, I'm heavily up on scoring because of like the multiple turns of scoring multiple zones. But it's only the end of turn 6. There's a great deal more of the game left to go. You can't just get that lead and then be like, oh, I've won. It's very easy to imagine that you have, but no, there are 4 turns left in this game. I have to win somewhere and establish that slide into the end game where something is just sitting on this zone for the rest of the game, which means that I have to try and win up here. And to the surprise of absolutely no one, I do not win up here. What's going on now? Yep, and the knights are dead. Really, we have to make sort of some decisions at this point. In terms of what has happened this game, the Tempered Sorcerer has blown up 2 units by himself in one activation. It happens. It's I think he's accounted for. Yeah, he has killed 4 regiments by himself right now. Are Dweghom Fire Sorcerers a little much? I think Dweghom Fire Sorcerers might be just a little much. He has killed 4 regiments literally by himself. The Fireforged have only ever made like 1 anemic clash and been a bunker. So he's killed 4 whole regiments, and he's now sitting on this objective. I had to make the call: do these Steel Legion go in this direction or this direction? And they had to make that call after the Dweghom Dragon Slayers made a long-range 5+ rerollable march charge into the flank of this regiment of crossbows. Now, what I was really hoping is that they would basically just posture here and sit on the objective and score, but Tom is a better player than that, and he saw the opportunity to make a march charge, and that march charge, if it had failed, would have left him in no man's land, scoring nothing, but because it succeeded, it carried him onto this objective with enough weight to score it. So I've made the very difficult decision that with my 2 remaining Steel Legion units, what I have to do is try and just roll well and salvage these fights. I have to actually engineer a decisive victory in the center and hope that the Sorcerer just stays all the way over there. Frankly, I have to get away from the Sorcerer. And this came after like quite a bit of time thinking about what would happen based on where this Steel Legion unit went. If it went in this direction and Tom won supremacy, they were dead and I would lose. If they go in this direction, I am at least out of range of the champion, the Sorcerer for now, and I can recharge into these Dragon Slayers. And although Dragon Slayers are hardened 2, which makes Steel Legion into sort of glorified Wifflebats, Steel Legion still have a lot of attacks, like a lot of attacks with the Drillmaster, which means that their attacks into the rear, rerolling resolve, I can maybe do enough damage to the Dragon Slayers to save this regiment, and if I can save this regiment, I can go into the flank of the Thanes here. Like maybe we can fight our way through this situation. It is ultimately a very forlorn hope, because the quality of Dweghom troops, particularly this unit of Thanes, the quality of Dweghom troops is just too high for 100 Kingdoms troops to fight without numeric superiority. But we're doing our best. The scenario lead is beginning to slip away from us here. Tom is going to score multiple zones. I will not. That's going to equalize over the course of the rest of the game. And as you might guess, there aren't a great deal more pictures for you to see. So this is the end of turn 7. The game is actually going to go all the way to turn 10, but this is the last picture that I've taken. Things are going to go rapidly downhill from here. We will eventually end up winning this fight and killing this unit of Dragon Slayers, but this unit of, and we do obviously like a lot of damage. This unit of Steel Legion has been able to make a full-on clash into this unit of Hold Thanes, done like a bunch of damage, but not enough damage. I'm rolling kind of slightly below average, and Tom has famously bad dice, but they aren't being famously bad late in the game. He had some real rough rolls, like I was rolling just nice consistently upper 50 percentile through sort of the first half of the game, but things are falling apart now. I actually have a couple of situations over the course of the rest of this game where I'll like make an uninspired clash with the Clash 4 Steel Legion, and then roll like 4 sixes that I would have been able to reroll if I'd inspired. But the game really was decided based on like this bad luck at the end now is a little bit nail in the coffin, but it's not what has decided the game. What decided the game was the outcome of this flank here and the decisions that I made. And what's at the precondition to that was how I chose to layer my ranged units, or specifically not layer them, and put them in a big long line. So we are actually going to succeed in killing the Dragon Slayers, but both of these units will die, this unit will die, and this unit will die, and Tom will end up with 2 units sitting on scoring zones, the big 3-inch objectives, for like the remainder of like the 1 turn that remains in the game after that. But it is enough to secure him the win, particularly when combined with the 34 victory points that he has gotten from killing units in my army. The game score ends something like 60 him, 50 to me, or thereabouts, which really is not too bad, all things considered. But what we were playing for was to test the concept, to test the MSU, multiple small units activation advantage concept. And to put a little bit of a conclusion on that, although I think that this kind of like full goblin mode style list is it's very interesting to play. Like to have that deep of a command deck, that many different things going on. It's very, very interesting. It isn't such an optimal, it's not even close to as optimal a strategy as it is in a game like Song of Ice and Fire. And while I think I could actually speak almost at length about just the differences between how those two games handle activations, and therefore why what is so powerful in Song is really not powerful in Conquest, and I think definitely to Conquest's merit, not having it be such a first order optimal strategy really is nice for Conquest, but it's really interesting to see why. And if we look at how Conquest structures itself, we can see all of these little like fingers on the scales away from MSU activation spam being an optimal strategy. It's because there are a number of reasons why. One of them obviously is that some scenarios like melee reward killing units, in which case having 15 minimum sized units is not scenario, it's just not scenario optimal. But even in scenarios unlike melee where you don't have unit scoring, a lot of the preconditions that exist in Song of Ice and Fire that allow players to perfectly and fluidly execute plans with like perfect information, including perfect information about who will be going first next turn, don't exist in Conquest. In Conquest, the Supremacy roll, and again, you'll note Supremacy roll is advantage to the player with fewer activations, fewer cards in their deck. The Supremacy roll means that you can never know who is going first for sure, except that one person will be advantaged every turn, the person with fewer activations. And the general fuzziness from having, like the tactical and strategic fuzziness that comes from having to build your command deck and in a certain way means you can't respond with perfect fluidity. On top of that, units in Conquest, unless you're playing a fluid formation unit, nothing in Conquest comes close to the like tactical flexibility that a unit in Song of Ice and Fire has. And that's not necessarily like a pro or a con to either game. Song of Ice and Fire is like a much more frictionless experience, but overcoming friction in a game is really significant, really important, really rewarding. How much friction there is in terms of executing your plans is a huge part of what sets aside and differentiates different games. So in Song of Ice and Fire, the relative frictionlessness of performing maneuvers with units means that you can like very easily pivot units on a dime, get them into a certain position, set up like flank charges, for example. Whereas in Conquest, flank charges are rarer, but when they happen, they're much, much more significant. And so all of these things, I think, come together to create an environment where having lots and lots and lots of activations like I did is potentially actually suboptimal, but at best an interesting strategic choice. And being able to actually accomplish that, I think, speaks very, very highly of the game. Like, it is very rare in an alternating activation game not to have activation count in some way become very, very meaningful. The fact that it's a nice to have but not essential, and sometimes you can intentionally play against it and run very elite armies in Conquest is really nice, and it's a really fine, like, the fact that they've dialed that in to the point where, like, I definitely felt like I was playing against Dweghom, i.e. the game was difficult, but I didn't feel like I was out of contention, and if I had won on the top flank here, I might be coming back to this report saying, like, yeah, you know, this is really interesting, and the ability to spread force, etc., is really cool. So I am actually going to experiment with this list a little bit more. But what I'm going to do in particular with future iterations is that the cavalry are going to go. Because I think if you're going to commit to this style of very high activation count list, and I might bring it down to like maybe 14 or 13 activations, depending. I've got a couple of different variations of the list. But the conclusion I've come to is what the list does need is that it needs to be much more certain about what the payoff for activation advantage is. And there are a few things I can think of that help me get that, but the two directions that I'm leaning in, either trying to get both or one of these into a list, is either a foot noble lord in some household guard who are not amazing, but his supremacy ability synergizes much better with things like the Steel Legion. And he gives me longbows, potentially 2 units of longbows, 4 stands per longbow unit. Longbows, being a very powerful ranged unit with arcing fire, can play into this kind of like they can stack together. They can let me force multiply and concentrate. They can do things like just deploy behind crossbows, for example. And I'm very comfortable having Imperial officers jump into them and giving them those orders. So that's possibility one, where the longbows are my payoff for activation advantage, and I can use my activation advantage to get volleys with the longbows and keep the longbows safe. The other consideration that I'm seriously thinking about is Theist Priest in militia blocks, because offensive spellcasting is actually one of the things that you can really get a lot of mileage out of if you have a lot of activations. Because the way that offensive spellcasting works is you're kind of layering the unit moving with the spellcaster then casting a spell, and if you have enough activations that the last, say, 2 or 3 activations in a round can be units moving and then Theist Priests casting spells without your opponent being able to respond, you can potentially do a lot of damage that way. And Theist Priests are sneaky powerful spellcasters. Holy Fire is a really good offensive spell because it just deals 2 hits per success. And you can like take a pretty, even just a priest 6 Theist Priest can potentially do quite a lot of damage. Like he inflicts on average 6 hits per attack, and those hits cause resolve. But I particularly like, if you pay for all of the same stuff that's going on to this Tempered Sorcerer, you can get pretty good output. And if you're doing that, you aren't taking veterans, you're taking Relentless Drill, and Relentless Drill makes militia blocks like not terrible. And the Theist Priests go in the militia blocks and make them scoring. My experience with those militia blocks is that it's very easy to overestimate them. Like, they look very impressive up until they die because they're just militia, but they're not nothing, and that might be another way of like getting some payoff into the list, which the cavalry don't do. The cavalry, I think, are very good on their merits, but they don't play into what this list is trying to do, which is leverage activation advantage. So all in all, a very narrow loss to Dweghom. Quite happy with how the game went overall. Some tactical errors, a lot of learning experiences, some things that I will do differently next time, but definitely a very good and very interesting game. And it's the kind of game that I really cherish because it was one where I got to test a theory and come up with further changes, like further things I can do to maybe improve things next time. So we might see some more games, more very heavily proxied 100 Kingdoms, but otherwise, as always, if you enjoy what I do, you can support me via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description, and as otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.